Hello everyone, this is Ben Dunn, your AP Sensei, founder of Antarctic Press, a comic book company established in 1985, celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. The year of our Lord 2025. So I got quite a bit of reaction from my last video comparing why I think Ripperverse is going to outlast COMICSGATE. And some people may come under the impression that I dislike COMICSGATE. No, I don't. Nothing can be further from the truth. I don't dislike COMICSGATE. I don't dislike anybody. I mean, to be honest, the comic industry needs more people who are willing to take chances and to create comics. What I was trying to allude to was that the COMICSGATE model, as a business model, is extremely flawed, and I'll tell you why. The difference is that COMICSGATE is a movement. Originally, and people have said this, is that it was a consumer movement. It was meant to counter the shift in attitude in the big comic book companies, specifically Marvel and DC, in terms of what they were doing and what they were producing. I get that. If you don't like what a company is producing, you don't have to buy it. But if you do like what they're producing, then you will buy it. You will support it. And the comics was reaction. Now, the thing is that I was at the Big Bang of COMICSGATE. I was there when it was born. Okay, yes, Enterprise was going to publish Jawbreakers. It was a title that was recommended to us by Brian Denham, who was keeping up. He was an editor, who still is an editor at Antarctic Press at the time. And I really was aware of Richard C. Myers. In fact, I followed his YouTube channel quite religiously because I thought what he was saying sort of resonated with a lot of people who were collecting comics at the time and who were big fans of Marvel and DC and hated to see the direction they were going. I'm an old school collector, reader, so I did not understand what they were doing. But, well, I'll take that back. I did understand what they were doing, and it was deliberate, and that's fine. I just chose not to support it. And Richard C. Myers seemed to reflect the feelings of a lot of old-time readers and collectors, and that we were very much against what they were doing. But the thing was, he also created a lot of enemies, is a word I'm thinking of. A lot of detractors, a lot of people who didn't like his style of criticizing the output of the big two. And okay. The thing was, it was effective. Richard C. Meyer garnered a huge audience, and he really played up on that. And I don't fault him for that. He knew what he was doing and he wanted to do it, and that's fine. Kudos to him to have the courage to do it. But he was also putting his money where his mouth was. He was creating a comic book. They challenged him to create his own comic, and he took up that challenge. And he created a book called Jawbreakers. And Jawbreakers was going to be an Antarctic Press comic. I was familiar with Jawbreakers. In fact, when I found out that Brian Denham had picked up the title, I was actually very ecstatic. I was very happy that we had picked it up. I'll be honest with you. It was a not only was it a good-looking book, I had not read it at the time, but it not only was a good-looking book, Brian assured me it was a very good read, too, as well. So when we announced that we were going to do Jawbreakers, we thought we were going to have a lot of support for it. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Almost immediately, Antarctic Press, and specifically, the owner, my brother Joe, and was inundated with huge amounts of negative and hateful responses. And we hadn't my brother had not realized, what kind of, I loathe this word, but it seems to fit the toxicity of what Richard C. Meyer had created in the comic book community. And when he got a call from Mark Waid, Mark Waid is not an unimportant individual. He is a very well-known legend in the comic book industry, and somebody that my brother respected quite a bit, and I respect quite a bit, both as a writer and as a creator. When he, called and expressed his concern about us doing Jawbreakers, that was really the final straw that broke the back, that we could not proceed with Jawbreakers, and we could not take the amount of backlash that was coming our way. And as a company, we have to make a decision whether or not this is going to benefit us, in the end, or is it going to hurt us in the end. And the decision was made not to publish Jawbreakers. And we contacted Richard Meyer, and told him, and he was very agreeable to the situation, and he decided to go ahead and publish it on himself. So, because of that, it created a chain of events that led to the formation of COMICSGATE. Now, the term COMICSGATE, I think, was used, initially as a way to label what had happened to Jawbreakers and Richard C. Myers. And, it's actually, some people say it started with the milkshake girl photo. That probably was the genesis of the movement, but it certainly didn't create anything to the likes of what we see now, with COMICSGATE. Now, I have nothing against COMICSGATE as a movement. I feel like if it's something that is, if it's something that someone wants to do, then fine. No one's stopping you from doing it. We live in a country where you're able to just do whatever you want. And that's wherein lies the problem with COMICSGATE as, a business model. As a movement, you are free to follow whatever dream you want. And if you want to use COMICSGATE as a label to garner your sales up, then that's fine. And it seems to me that's what it is. It's just a movement. It's just a label to attach to a project in order to get the audience that supports COMICSGATE. Now, it's a sizable audience. It's not tremendously big. I will say that, just off the top of my head, based on sales I've seen, there's probably no more than maybe 3,000-4,000 people who are diehard, staunch COMICSGATers. But that's a large amount of people, that can make a big difference on a campaign. Some say the magic number for a campaign is 1,000 people, 1,000 backers. If you get 1,000 backers and you keep 1,000 backers forever, you can go on for a very long time. And I'm not sure if that number is accurate, but I think that's what I've heard. And I've done the calculation. It looks like if you get 1,000 backers, you're going to do pretty well. Anything above that, it's going to be great. You're going to do fantastic. The thing is that COMICSGATE is a loose, affiliation of several creators, with no real, no real person in charge. Because every COMICSGATE creator can do whatever he wants, without the interference of another comics book creator. But they can still all use the same label. So if the behavior of one comics book creator is negative, there's not much the other comics book creators can do, when they can pressure him, yes, they can certainly, bear down and make them eventually leave. But for the most part, they can't really do much, as far as getting rid of any negative influences in COMICSGATE. Most of the people who've left COMICSGATE have left on their own volition. because they disagreed with the way it's heading, or they just dislike the people that are in it. The thing is ComicsGate is not a business. See, that's the fundamental difference between ComicsGate as a whole and the Ripperverse. See, with the Ripperverse, you have one person in charge, Eric July. Everything stops with him. He makes all the decisions. He sets the agenda. He hires and fires people. He sets the direction of his company, and he's ultimately responsible for it. So as long as he is willing to keep going at it, his company will survive. And if, depending on how his products do, will thrive. And I think that, his business model, while definitely unusual, is proven to be highly successful. I'm not going to talk about, how much money they make. Personally, it's none of my business. My business is to see, how well Antarctic Press does. And looking at Eric July's model, there's something there that could possibly be, delivered over into Antarctic Press as well. We've been around for 40 years. We've seen a lot of things, and we'd like to think that we can adapt. We're not so rigid in our thinking, and that we can't make changes in order for the company to continue to survive. And there's a reason why we've been around for 40 years, because we are able to adapt and change. And I think another reason is that Eric July is a businessman. He said so many times. He claims to be, and that's something that is of fundamental importance. The thing about ComicsGate is as far as I know, there are several individual businessmen. Okay, they run their own little fiefdom in the ComicsGate kingdom. They do their own thing. They run their business as they see fit. All ComicsGate is a label. That's all it is. And as long as that label provides some value, it will remain. Once ComicsGate itself, as a label, becomes less attractive as far as garnering more and more business, then it will wane in importance. That's just the nature of things. If you want ComicsGate to survive as an entity, here is some things that I think would help. You don't have to take my advice. I'm just giving you what I've learned from experience. ComicsGate has to be a business. Okay, it has to incorporate. It has to have a head, a CEO or an editor-in-chief to oversee the quality, to oversee the deliverability, to oversee the costs of doing their comics. I mean, I'm sure Eric July, because he does so many comics, he gets a good rate on printing. Because he can gang print. He probably gets a good rate on a lot of things because he can control, the method of how he's going to produce things. With ComicsGate, you have 5, 6, 7 different creators who all have their own little kingdoms, and they all go to various different printers, different things. Imagine how much they could save if they could just all gang print together at one printer, or combine their resources so that they all could thrive. But it's not that way, because who makes the decision and who does what is something that ComicsGate can't tolerate, because every single one has their own agenda. And that is where the weakness lies. It's that they all have their own agenda, so there is no direction to ComicsGate other than the person who's in charge, which I presumably is Ethan Van Sciver, who I have great respect for. And to me, his success in terms of being able to sell comics is, quite enviable. However, he has one weakness, is not his inability to deliver his product on time. Now, some people may poo-poo that as being something that's unimportant, but in this case it is, because you're delivering a promised timely product, and people can only wait so long before they become irritated or frustrated, or discouraged by it. Can you imagine if any other product, was delayed that long? I mean, back in the 1800s, it was common for people to wait months, maybe even years for a product, But this is a comic book. It shouldn't take years for a comic book to come out. We have a rule at Antarctic Press when we do Kickstarters or crowdfunders or Indiegogos or whatever. The book has to be complete before we will offer it, to our audience. Has to be complete, 100% complete. Every single crowdfunder or Indiegogo that Antarctic Press does, and myself included, is 100% complete and ready to go the minute it's launched. And I think that is the model that Eric July is using. He's using that he's not going to launch anything unless it's 100% complete. He knows that it'll be delivered. And this is why people trust him, and this is what it comes down to, is trust. If people can't trust you to deliver your product on time, then you're eventually going to lose that trust. And it's going to affect your business. I'm not going to lecture or say anything about how ComicsGate runs its business, because that's really none of my business. But as a outside observer, who's been following a lot of this drama for a while, I feel I had to really interject into, the debate, the discussion, so to speak, and I really think that I want to see ComicsGate succeed, to be honest. I really do, but I don't think it will, based on its current trajectory. It just doesn't look like it's going to last that long. I mean, it could last another 5 years. It could last another 10 years. But eventually, it's going to go away. Because it cannot be sustained in its present model. The difference is that Ripperverse, is a legitimate business run by a person in charge. If Jared July, were to somehow disappear tomorrow, his company would still continue. Someone would pick up the pieces and they would run with it, because they know there's money to be made, with Eric July's Ripperverse. The same cannot be said with ComicsGate. EVS is the self-proclaimed leader of the movement, but he really is not so much as a leader as he is a figurehead. If he was a leader, he would, try to direct where ComicsGate is going and how to do it. Unfortunately, he's not setting a good example by having his books be late and his product, and he's constantly putting out new product, without fulfilling the previous product. We will never do that. Enterprise will never, never release a book that's not 100% complete, 100% complete. And we have a good track record. You can look at all our campaigns. Every single one of them has been fulfilled, unless they didn't, meet their funding goal, So, yeah, you can say all sorts of things about me. I don't care. You're allowed to say that. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing because it makes me happy. And really what it comes down to is really what makes you happy. If you're happy with what you're doing, then don't let anyone tell you to do something different. And yes, it's a fact. I am a little, envious about some of these successes, but you know what? I look at it as a good thing, because whenever a comic book is successful, it means people are buying them. People are wanting to get them. People will support them. And that, to me, is a positive thing. I love that. I love to see every single, if I had my way, I would have every single comic book creator have, huge success. I want people to have success. I will grant you that Antarctic Press is not a big company. No. We've had our successes back here and there over the decades. You know, what keeps us going is our commitment, not only to the comics as an art form, but as a business. I don't have to worry too much, as far as me financially, because I get a salary. I usually get a salary, and then I supplement my salary with occasional crowdfunding projects, and I'm happy with that. And one of the fundamental things is that also a big thing is that Eric July probably reinvests all his money back into the company, or not all his money. I'm sure he pays himself, but I'm sure he reinvests the profits from his company back into the company, and that's what it will allow it to grow. This is the another fundamental difference is that ComicsGate does not reinvest its money into the movement. It reinvests its money into the individual creators, because that is what I'm assuming their main source of income is. And as long as they can maintain that cash flow, then they're going to keep at it. Once that cash flow stops, then where are they now? That's the fundamental difference. Same with Anarch Press. We take all the profits that we make, not only to pay our bills, and things like that, but we also reinvest it into finding new creators, to find new ways to expand our market, and just basically try to make the company, as big as possible. Now, we're learning that the paradigm is changing, and we have to change with it. So my biggest thing is that I am not against ComicsGate. If you get the impression that I am, not. I don't hate it. I don't, but I don't support it either. And I also feel like if you want a little bit of advice from me, I think that some changes need to be made if you want it to continue to succeed. So that's really all I had to say. Until next time, this has been Dunn signing off.